For us this afternoon in Cape Town, and is now going to find out what well-known economist Thabi Leoka is going to look out for.
Indeed, Jeremy. Thanks very much. We do have Thabi Leoka, as you have just said, but also Sanusha Naidu, both of whom are going to help us unpack. In fact, we're going to start by putting into context today's speech. In other words, the background, Thabi and Sanusha, against which today's events are going to take place. Well, a lot has been said about the need for the minister to restore the country's credibility in the face of both potential investors, local and foreign, but also the country itself, whether he has what it takes to actually take us out of the quagmire that we've been put in as a country through, in part, years of misrule under Jacob Zuma's administration.
Yes, indeed. So I think the first thing is that international investors and local investors have been very positive on the current new minister, Didomboweni. And so I think that's just one easy, quick win. The other thing is that he's obviously a minister 2 weeks before the MTBPS. So this is not necessarily his MTBPS, and I think we'll start to get a sense of who he is in terms of his current position in February next year at the budget. But having said that, he's a minister who now presides over a country or a department which had projected 1.5% GDP growth in February, and if you look at current forecasts, either if you look at the Reserve Bank or analysts forecasting below 1%. So he's dealing with a country that is underperforming. He's also dealing with a country that needs to close its debt. So he has to shrink their budget deficit, cut expenditure further, and also shrink the revenue shortfall. And this comes at a time it's very difficult to shrink the revenue shortfall when GDP is so low. Remember that the first half of this year the country saw or experienced recession. So we haven't yet seen positive data yet. So there's a lot that he needs to deal with, how to shrink the budget deficit. On the positive side, I think the revenues have done better than expected so far. But on the other side is that the deficit is created by the gap between the revenue and expenditure. Expenditure is a problem, and the problem within the expenditure is wages. And so how will he deal with the wages given the current environment, political environment leading up to elections next year, but also environment where unions are putting pressure on government to say, look, you can't afford to cut employment or cull people who work in government because we have a very high, almost 40% unemployment rate if you include the discouraged workers. So there's a lot that he needs to do in terms of maneuvering or through this environment, and yet appeasing most people, which is very difficult to do currently.
I want us to get into the detail of all the issues that you've mentioned, and I'm going to ask you, Sanusha, if you will pick up just on the last point of the wage bill. He has already made those comments that he thinks the wage bill is too huge, and organizations like ESCOM in particular have much much higher numbers than he believes they should have. But already you had the ANC's allies, already starting, hang on a minute, that is not where we think the problems are. The problems of ESCOM, for an example, have very little to do with a huge wage bill from where we stay. It's got to do with corruption. It's got to do with how the parastatal is being managed. It's got to do with the municipal debt and all these other things. What's your take?
He has a tough job. I mean, he's caught between a rock and a hard place, and just going on the wage bill itself, I mean, if he's going to cut the wage bill, which I think is, if I'm not mistaken, about a third of the GDP of the country, that's quite a lot. But to do that, he's got to be really, really strategic, and that's the key way in which he needs to think about this. Because if he's going to start thinking about where does he need to start essentially putting together some kind of policy reform both in the context of the SOEs, but also in the context of maneuvering the bureaucracy of the state. Then he has to think about which are essential services and which services that you can start thinking about in terms of perhaps streamlining ministries, streamlining departments, putting them together, and that's going to be the big test, I think, a litmus test for him in this MTA mini budget speech, because the point here is that the ANC is going into an election. It needs all the votes that it can get. It needs the alliance partners to say, we endorse you and we are going to encourage our constituencies to vote for you. But if you're going to pull jobs and you're going to cull jobs, that is going to be a different ballgame. So the challenge for the ANC is twofold. One, how do they create a domestic environment that is relatively stable, which sends the right message both to international investors but also to credit rating agencies to say that we are doing what we are supposed to have been doing, which you've been telling us in terms of policy certainty, reform of the SOE sector, a kind of weeding out the bureaucracy of different types of inertia and things that need to be weeded out. But at the same time, you keep jobs. Because if you're going to start thinking about how you streamline the bureaucracy and looking at the wage bill, it's going to create this whole thing around, are you contributing to the jobless growth? And that's the big challenge. So, at this point in time, you've got new graduates coming into the market who don't have jobs. And they're sitting at home, and the private sector is not hiring them because the private sector says there's a mismatch of skill. Now, where do they go? For example, in education, you've got new teachers coming out for primary and secondary education. You've got teachers that are probably coming to the point where they need to be at some level, maybe an early retirement program or a rollout that needs to come out. But you need that skill transfer. So the question here is, if you're going to pay and have an early severance package for the teachers around about 60, 65, where does that money come from the state?
Okay. I want us to get into the kind of support that he needs to rely on to do whatever it is that is going to announce today. We've seen what is taking place at that SARS commission of inquiry. The stuff that's coming out of there is really, terrible, to say the least. Fingers have been pointed at the Reserve Bank around the VBS saga, for example, whether it did what it could do. And some questions are now being asked about Treasury's ability to rein in everybody or to manage the finances the way everybody thought they could do only a few years ago. And that's what I want us to focus on. But for now, we're going to take a quick break and take you to Johannesburg before we get to that part of our discussion with our panel, Sanusha Naidu and Tabi Lioka.